1 in 3 Australians will get cancer before the age of 74. Every year, 75,000 new patients are diagnosed. But today, nearly 60% will survive.
There are a lot of survivors out there who are leading extraordinarily rich, maybe greatly enriched lives beyond what they were before. But there are also a large number of survivors out there who are leading lives that are full of stress.
Groundbreaking Australian research has revealed that for many people, cancer survival comes at a devastating cost.
I'd been through 2 experiences of cancer, and the thought that my marriage wasn't going to survive after 30 years of a harmonious, loving relationship was just so wounding.
You feel like you're some sort of monster or something that is crude and cruel and, no compassion at all.
Until now, nobody ever imagined that, like survivors of war or natural disaster, cancer survivors may need help to recover from the trauma. Tonight on Four Corners, we look at a hidden syndrome, life after cancer.
While early diagnosis and prompt treatment makes most cancers curable, the word cancer is a problem in itself.
I'm a great believer that we, as physicians, make more mistakes by not using the word cancer, by disguising it, by erecting smoke screens between ourselves and the patient.
Cancer was once an unmentionable disease. It had such terrible connotations that patients were spared the knowledge of the nature of their illness. It was, and still is, seen as a death sentence. 30 years ago, this Four Corners film attempted to get people to acknowledge the very existence of cancer.
Despite the accelerator's enormous power of some 4 million volts, radiotherapy is usually a lengthy process.
But even back then, people were surviving cancer.
When I first came home from hospital, I had many sessions of dissolving into self-pity. But I think this is a pretty normal reaction.
And what about yourself now? Can you do everything that you did before?
I can do everything. I can do the washing and handle 2 children and scrub the floors and dig the garden. I've been doing all those things. I tend the front garden myself.
Many thousands of people are now beating cancer thanks to advances in medical science. But according to new research from Sydney University, victory over cancer is not the end of the journey. In some cases, it's just the beginning of a much deeper struggle, which may even be worse than the original diagnosis and treatment.
That sounds extreme and it sounds exaggerated, but it's a message that we've got over and over again. People knew what to do when they were ill. People knew what to do who were around the ill person. But afterwards, no one knows what to do, and it's very dark.
There aren't any clear-cut roles for the survivor, and therefore there can't be any clear-cut roles for the carer. So I think we need to talk about that, because that's the group that doesn't get a Guernsey anywhere else. And yet they may not.
4 years ago, Professor Miles Little was one of Australia's most eminent surgeons. He now heads up a centre which investigates values, ethics and the law in medicine at Sydney University. He and his team of researchers are now doing pioneering research into cancer survival. It's an issue which they stumbled onto by chance during a major research project into healthcare values.
What I thought I'd mention would be Desprez's book as a good kind of general overview of the literature of survival.
While we were doing the work on cancer patients, we noticed a number of common features in all their narratives. And in particular, we were struck by the fact that survivors, people who appeared to be free of cancer after the phase of diagnosis and treatment, were a lot less happy than we would have anticipated that they would be.
I'm stressing that it's an existential state, not a pathology.
Their findings, the culmination of a 4-year research project, were a revelation and have attracted wide overseas interest. The work has already been presented to the Mayo Clinic in the United States and to the recent World Congress on Psycho-Oncology.
I've had lots of patients say to me that the time when they feel most abandoned, most lost, is when treatment has ceased. They often talk about being given a pat on the back and a pat on the head and told you're done, you're finished, you're cured, although they won't often hear the words you're cured, and then sent on their way. And there's a strong sense of abandonment that they talk about.
There is a common thread to survivor stories. Priorities change. Relationships often disintegrate. Some feel guilty for having survived when fellow patients didn't. Workplace discrimination is not unusual. Survivors live in fear of recurrence, and they're saddled with the stigma.
It's a very important issue because we're producing thousands of survivors each year in this country. And every single one of those survivors has a circle of family, friends, intimates, work colleagues, all of whom are affected by this.
Jane Cruikshank was a gregarious woman. A former nurse, a strong and competent career woman, always in control. She was the president of the local P&C. In later years, she worked with her husband in his engineering business and travelled the world with him.
I would describe her as a North Shore corporate wife. Big dinner parties with lots of guests. She'd be the life and soul of the party. Nothing was too difficult for her.
The house was paid for, her children were educated and leaving home. Life was looking pretty rosy. Then 5 years ago, Jane got cancer.
Actually, I was getting dressed one morning and I just bumped against my breast on the left-hand side, and I thought, oh, that was a funny sort of a pain. I went off to the office and I was sitting in front of a computer later on, and I suddenly felt a sort of pain shoot through my arm for no particular reason. So when that happened and I had this sort of stabbing pain, I thought, I just automatically picked the phone up. I didn't stop to think about it. I just knew it was something I had to do.
We just didn't know what to say, didn't know what to feel. We just felt, oh, gosh, that's something awful. That's cancer, you know. We don't understand what it means other than sort of having this sort of feeling that it's something rather serious and possibly rather terminal. And so it stopped us all in our tracks, obviously, and gave us a very bad shock.
The next day, Jane's breast was removed. The cancer had spread to the lymph nodes, so they were also removed.
I can remember getting dressed to go to theatre, and as they're pushing the trolley along, I can remember the wheel. I think I know every single turn that trolley made on the way to the theatre. And that was when I began to feel everything closing in around me. I was terribly afraid of dying. And I was afraid of no longer being attractive to my husband.
She had lost her breast, and it you know, there was this physical piece missing from her, and a very important piece to her, I suppose, to both of us. And that was something that was very hard to cope with. I know she couldn't cope with it early on at all.
Soon after I came out of hospital, I think my husband, who loves me deeply, wanted to really show how much he cared for me and to engage in contact as we had done before. But I found that I was backing away from it. I couldn't cope with it. And that made him